I hope that your Lent is going well during these first few days. Many of us make sacrifices during Lent, motivated by the example of Jesus fasting in the desert for 40 days. The Church certainly asks and expects us to do so. Though we may be tempted to think of our sacrifices as nothing more than denying ourselves of some comfort or pleasure, such as meat or chocolate or beer, the implication of the very word sacrifice is that it's done or given for a higher purpose, which in its original context was explicitly religious. And so we can hear the obvious connection between the words sacrifice and sacred, that is holy. A sacrifice in the truest sense is a material gift offered to God and as an outward manifestation of our worship of Him with the goal of establishing or improving our relationship with God. Since the time of Jesus in both Judaism and Christianity, for different reasons, the notion of sacrifice has been somewhat spiritualized and less obviously material. However, certainly at the time of Jesus, when the Temple of Jerusalem was standing and the animal sacrifices were being offered, a sacrifice was more likely to include offering some material thing to God as a gift. Our first reading from the book of Deuteronomy mentions a particular kind of sacrifice or class of sacrifice, a sacrifice of first fruits, that is, giving to God the first crops harvested. Though this is a Jewish instance, the offering of first fruits is not an exclusively Jewish notion or practice. The offering to a God of first fruits seems to have sprung up naturally among ancient agricultural peoples around the world from their belief that the first crops were the best crops, and that these were owed to God out of a matter of justice as acknowledgement of His gifts. Though perhaps seemingly simplistic or primitive, it may be, in a way, a simple and ideal answer to the practical question that we have faced at a meal, especially a special meal at a gathering of friends or family. Who will be served first? And of course, in offering the first fruits to God, the answer is God. God is to be served first. For the Jewish people of Jesus' time and before that, the offering of the first fruit sacrifice was governed by laws from the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, sometimes called, including the portion of the book of Deuteronomy we heard in our first reading. So they weren't to be offered sort of willy-nilly or however we wanted to. There was a prescribed way to offer the first fruits, and we heard about that in Deuteronomy. As we heard, the first fruits of the harvest were brought to God. They were brought to God, where God resided. They were brought to the Temple of Jerusalem. They were presented to and received by a temple priest who set them in front of the altar of sacrifice at the temple. The one who had brought the sacrifice then said thanks to God for having saved him and his family from slavery in Egypt and given them the fruitful promised land of Israel that allowed him to offer the very sacrifice of first fruits. And this was followed by a festive meal. So hopefully, as you think of some of those components, going to where God resides, the sacrifices being received by a priest at the altar, some words of thanksgiving, followed by a meal. Hopefully you've connected some of the dots and recognized that the Jewish understanding of sacrifice is the foundation of our Christian understanding of sacrifice, and especially as it pertains to the sacrifice of the Mass. And so, of course, one of the consequences of this is that attending the holy sacrifice of the Mass is essential to our relationship to the one true God revealed by Jesus. Jesus told us at the Last Supper, "No one comes to the Father except through me." And we actually believe this. We actually believe that. It's just not a nice idea. No one comes to God the Father except through Jesus. We believe this. The Church believes in the mediation of Christ alone as his supreme priesthood. Jesus Christ is our high priest. It is only through him and with him and in him, as I will say later in the Mass, that we can reach God the Father. It is at Mass that our sacrifices are able to be united with the sacrifice of Jesus made present on the altar and received by God the Father in a pleasing manner. And it's somewhat unfortunate, though I'm glad that some of us are participating by way of the stream and on video, and given the weather, it's perhaps even more understandable. But this is precisely this notion of sacrifice, the theology of sacrifice. This is precisely why watching Mass at a distance on a screen is not as efficacious as attending Mass. It is here in the church where God resides in the most holy sacrament, during the sacrifice of the Mass, where and when Jesus offers God the Father his sacrifice and ours along with his to God the Father through the ministry of his priest. It is in this way that God truly receives the sacrifices that we make during Lent, whether that is the fasting we've done on Ash Wednesday, the abstaining from meat on Fridays, or any other voluntary sacrifices that we make. It's essential that we do those things, but they are given, they are presented, they are exchanged at the Mass. That is when the transfer takes place, and that it is the transfer of possession, so to speak, from us to God that is essential to the sacrifice. And so it is worth considering, I think, what are we offering to God when we attend Mass this Lenten season? Is it something like the valuable first fruits described in our first reading? Is it something precious and valuable? Or, hopefully not, is it more like the scraps of our lives, that time, the effort, and the resources that are perhaps left over once we have been completely satisfied? It is worth considering at this beginning of Lent, and perhaps such a consideration will even make us to change a thing or two in our Lenten practices. One practical thing to consider is making a morning offering. I suspect those my age and older are familiar with this expression, perhaps those younger not as much. Traditionally speaking, a morning offering is a prayer made upon rising from bed, offering the coming day to God. It is a prayer one makes almost immediately upon rising from bed, offering the day to God. Here is a fine example. O Jesus, through the Immaculate Heart of Mary, I offer you the prayers, works, joys, and sufferings of this day, for all the intentions of your Sacred Heart in union with the holy sacrifice of the Mass throughout the world, in reparation for my sins and for our Holy Mother, the Catholic Church. Amen. That's, of course, the end of the prayer. And it's a fine example for many reasons, including that it recognizes the significance of the Mass as I have tried to explain it today. It recognizes in that particular morning offering, and some do not, but I like this one in that it says, in union with the holy sacrifice of the Mass throughout the world. It recognizes that it is in the Mass that these sacrifices that we've made are actually being presented to God. As I said, it's a fine example, but we are completely free to use our own words. And so again, I encourage that practice of making a morning offering. May the sacrifice of Jesus made present on the altar in the Blessed Sacrament, to whom we will unite our Lenten sacrifices, give us the graces we need to offer him the best we have to offer.